do they have the motor actions in the first place, right? Have they developed those skills? Can they skip? Can they jump? Can they clap? Can they imitate those kinds of, motor actions in the first place? What's their balance? What's their coordination look like?
Dyspraxia is not as well known as other types of neurodiversity, and although some people may have heard of it, they may not really have a full understanding of what it is. Today we'll talk with two people. First, an expert on dyspraxia, and second, someone with the diagnosis of dyspraxia. They've both authored books on the subject, and they've both agreed to join us today. That's straight ahead on episode 140. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dyspraxia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity Podcast.
So, how did you find our podcast? Was it through a friend or a family member who told you about us? Or did you find us by searching through a podcast app or on social media? The more people we reach, the better we're able to move forward the conversation about neurodiversity. And one way that you can help us, and it only takes a minute, is to leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. It only takes a few clicks, and it helps us more than you know. Today, we're talking about dyspraxia with Keri Wilmot, author of Wired Differently, a teacher's guide to understanding sensory processing issues. And then we'll talk to Rosemary Richings, author of the book Stumbling Through Space and Time, Living Life with Dyspraxia. First is Keri Wilmot. Keri, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So to start off, can you give us a description of what dyspraxia is and how it impacts people?
Yeah, so I guess the easiest way to explain it would be is to talk about it. I guess the more known name is motor planning, right? So I think a lot of people hear dyspraxia and they think, oh my gosh, that's such a scary word. So it's really difficulty motor planning. And what we talk about with motor planning involves skills like coordination and balance and fine motor control. And basically the message that the brain sends to those muscles and joints when you have a plan and you want to enact it. And so some people have difficulty coordinating those muscles and getting activities done. And it's really about the process. And I guess it's kind of tricky to explain, right? Because you can have balance and coordination challenges, but not necessarily be dyspraxic. You could know, I want to, stand up and walk across the room, and you know how to get there, and your brain is telling you how to do it, except for that your muscles and joints aren't doing the right thing. But then when we talk a little bit more about dyspraxia for kids that have disabilities, is that it really is more the process also impacting the balance and coordination, right? It's conceiving the plan and then having to enact on that plan. So, you could, especially with new activities. For example, when you give kids something that's novel, that they haven't learned, that they haven't practiced. Let's say we're going to work on tying shoelaces. And there's a lot of steps. There's a lot of actions. There's a lot of coordination and thought that needs to go into that plan. And you're thinking about what you want to do, but your fingers aren't doing it in the right way, and you're getting overwhelmed. So it's a problem where you can't actually figure out what to do and then use your muscles on how to actually solve the problem or get the motor action completed.
So it sounds like this can really impact somebody in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
So you gave the example of tying shoes, but what are some other manifestations of how this might impact an individual's daily life?
It really could be almost any skill that they're having trouble with. There's also, and this is where it gets a little complicated too, because people talk about speech apraxia and they talk about difficulty with controlling the muscles in their mouth to be able to produce sounds to then say words. So there are different forms of praxis in terms of what it impacts with specific skills. So as an occupational therapist, I'm looking at kind of the motor action. So things like tying your shoelaces, things like holding a pencil, writing your name, writing sentences, the coordination you would need to be able to hold your pencil, get all those thoughts, get everything down on the paper, also falls in line to dysgraphia. Like there's no simple way to say that this is something that is not an easy topic to talk about, especially when you're talking about kids that have challenges, because is it something, it can fall part and parcel with lots of other different diagnoses. And so it's really, really hard to sort of tease out, like, can we just put dyspraxia in its own box and let it stay there? Probably not. There may be other things that are going on. But for us, for OTs, we're looking at activities of daily living. Maybe it's showering, a whole routine of how to take all your clothes off, get in the bathtub, wash yourself, get out of the bathtub, put all those clothes back on, right? There's a lot of steps that has to go into that process.
It's interesting you touched on this, but I was wondering about how dyspraxia intersects with other types of neurodiversity. So you mentioned dysgraphia, for example, can kind of overlap there. Speech apraxia is kind of a more of in the speech language realm, but where are some of those overlaps? And also, how do you differentiate between dyspraxia? I mean, is it one of those things where you just don't always know? You kind of just support the interventions and try to work through it?
Yeah. So I think over time, when you're sort of used to looking and evaluating kids like I am as a therapist, you sort of can spot the warning signs. In terms of like diagnoses, we're looking at things like developmental motor coordination disorders, autism, sensory processing disorders. Those are the kinds of disabilities that would also have like symptoms where you would want to look at things like the balance, coordination, and all those skills are impacted. So we're sort of in tune to constantly looking at it when we're evaluating. And so for me, it's more about like, there's no specific test I feel like I could give a child that's going to say like, yes, they're going to get a standard score on the dyspraxia scale that at least I know of. I don't, there could be something, but I don't know of it. And so for me, it's more about, I use my observation skills while we're doing activities and doing testing. And I see, okay, if I want the child to do something, like let's say they're in preschool and the teacher wants them to participate in actions to Old MacDonald Had a Farm, right? They're singing a song and the teacher wants them to perform some motor actions on demand with a lot of stuff going on. And so I'm watching, like, how is that child participating? First off, do they have the motor actions in the first place, right? Have they developed those skills? Can they skip? Can they jump? Can they clap? Can they imitate those kinds of, motor actions in the first place? What's their balance? What's their coordination look like? And then I'm looking at, okay, well, when somebody gives them a novel or a new direction and they haven't practiced it or they haven't learned it, can they figure it out? And so really, we can't expect everybody to just perform perfectly on demand, right? There is a normal process of motor learning where you would practice and learn. And as you learn, you get better with time. And so these are the kinds of kids, though, that they give you that like deer in the headlights look. They might be running away. They're talking about something else that happened. They're distracted and because they don't know what to do. And so then you kind of sort of break it down. Okay, first I need you to do this skill. Watch me. Then I need you to do this, so what we do as occupational therapists is we teach them how to learn those individual skills, and then we practice them. And then we teach them how to pair them into a routine over time. And so we'll often work on a lot of things like obstacle courses. Can you walk on your hands for 10 feet and then hop like a bunny for 10 feet and then roll like a log and then let's do it all over again. So we're teaching them the skills that they need to build the balance and the coordination. We're pairing them together so that they can follow multiple steps over time. And then once they learn it, they get it. But usually it takes sometimes a lot longer and a lot more practice to get to a point where they can just perform those skills on demand with accuracy.
So at school or at home, they're probably just going to need some of those supports or obviously the explicit teaching and the additional time to learn those skills. Are there other accommodations that can be really useful for kids like this?
Yeah, breaking it down, having them watch you. Sometimes you might even actually need to take your hands and take their hands and do some kind of like a hand over hand action. Body awareness is another thing that sort of plays into this for kids that don't have great spatial awareness of where their body is in space. They can use some of those activities to sort of help just give them a better sense of how their muscles are moving before they perform those actions. So a lot of times we'll use visuals, like maybe picture cards. I use a lot of video modeling, so maybe it's me demonstrating it, but I find a lot more these days that people are really in tune. Once the pandemic hit and we switched over to telehealth, and now I was an occupational therapist working with kids through my computer screen, I became really cool because they thought it was a live YouTube channel, So a lot of times, like just using my camera, let's take a quick video. Let me show you a video of somebody else doing this action so that you can see what it looks like, practicing it, asking parents to practice it, asking teachers to practice it. And I guess that's the other part I think that we really need to look at for people is that you have to learn that skill and generalize it. And that's the hard part. And that's where people don't understand too. They're like, well, they know how to tie their shoelaces at home, but they can't do it at school. And so that skill generalization becomes really important to think about when we're dealing with kids that have skill generalization issues in the first place, right? Like, that skill that you learned in that routine, in that one environment is the same skill, but in a different place with a different teacher and a different routine. It's an entirely different skill to those particular kids. So that's something to think about in terms of trying not to be frustrated and understand, I don't understand why you could do it today, but you can't do it tomorrow, or you can't do it here, or you can do it for Grammy, but you can't do it for me. So that's, I think a lot of people get really frustrated. And then it leads to this sense of, well, the child is inconsistent. Why are they inconsistent? We need to hold them accountable for being consistent. And that leads sometimes into all these other behavioral overreactions because there's not an understanding of just that concept of, well, you changed the shoe. The laces are a different color. The verbal cues that you used were different, and so all those things to kids that have trouble with motor planning matter when we're asking them to perform skills.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Keri, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Our next guest is someone who has grown up with dyspraxia and writes about her experiences in her new book. That's coming up next.
On a previous episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Even before you seek that professional advice or consultation, evaluation, etc., you could start by having a conversation with your kid and have that conversation in a calm way. If you seem stressed and scared or panicked or angry or upset, then you're going to convey that to your kid as well. You could just start by asking some questions like, how are you doing? What is on your mind? Share a little bit of your experience and model to your family that it's okay to go through difficult emotional experiences. And we all do sometimes. Sometimes we're so determined to show our kids that we're there for them that without realizing it, we may also be giving the message it's bad to be rattled or it's not okay to be upset.
That's episode 110. Find it in your favorite podcast app.
I'm excited to welcome Rosemary Richings to the podcast. Rosemary's new book is Stumbling Through Space and Time, Living Life with Dyspraxia. Rosemary, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Dyspraxia is not as well known as other types of neurodiversity, and I feel like there's some confusion sometimes about dyspraxia and maybe even other diagnoses. So is there some overlap there?
Well, a lot of autistic people often just assume it's part of their autism, but really it's natural to do that. With any type of neurodiversity to be like, oh, it's just another symptom. But honestly, I like to think of it as it's normal and natural for people to get more than one type of diagnosis. And that is a more natural component of how you would get to know how people's brains work. So, yeah, that's completely natural to think that way. But, yeah, it's important for people to know that that is a separate component.
Some people might believe that dyspraxia is the same as being clumsy, for example, but that's not really accurate. So what are some of the main differences?
I always think of the clumsiness as a result of stress within your environment and processing the limitations of your environment and trying to process too much at once. Whereas clumsiness, for clumsiness' sake, can happen at any point in time. But to use just a very simplified example, if someone is trying to get you to get a cup of coffee, but they also want you to clean the floor, and there's a big crowd around you, and etc., then a dyspraxic person would react with spilling a glass or knocking into someone or something along that line.
So understanding kind of broadly what dyspraxia is, how does dyspraxia impact you personally?
It is very much a big part of why I have been a self-employed person for such a long time. I'm going on like 8 years now. And it really means there is only so much within my own work environment and life I can process in terms of the demands and processing instructions, processing my environment. People underestimate how much fatigue is involved in dyspraxia because you get very tired because you have to focus so hard on your own environment and your conversations and things like that. So that's where a lot of dyspraxic people struggle, both in school and in the workplace.
So it prompted you to become an entrepreneur and be self-employed. What about when you were young? How did it impact you when you were younger?
When I was younger, I really, I had the privilege of being diagnosed quite young, and that was helpful in some ways, but it affected how I learned just about everything because I needed alternate testing environments to be able to focus. I needed to take into consideration how I take notes, how I'm processing information. So I required a great deal of assistance in the area of special education, where I was younger with areas such as that.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the signs that prompted your family to seek a diagnosis? Like, what was that process like when you were young?
I remember there was a story my mother told me about how I fell down the stairs and I was learning how to walk at a slower rate than most of my peers. And that's how really my parents knew something was going on. The only reason that they applied a medical context to it, though, was because my dad is British, and the first resources really to come out about dyspraxia came out of the UK. There was nothing in Canada at that point. So he had managed to get a hold of a pamphlet on clumsy child syndrome, a term that is not acceptable to use anymore. And he was starting to see a lot of overlaps there. So it started as a conversation really with my GP. And then I started to go to a mental health practitioner as well, who put me through an extensive assessment process that lasted months.
Mm. What sorts of things do they do through that assessment process? What are some of the things that they're looking for?
That was a long, long time ago. I was only 4 at the time.
Oh, you were very young, yeah.
Yeah, so you'll have to excuse me on not having the full details. But as far as I recall, a lot of it was just about testing spatial perception and how I would react to movement-based instructions and how I would process complex movements in one environment versus the other. And that is largely from reading the assessment years later that was the main components that I was picking up on.
I know that there were some people who were really important in your life, both before and after you were diagnosed with dyspraxia. Can you tell us about a few of those people and the impact that they had?
Oh, yeah, there's a few really key ones. There was Dr. Sabrina, who was a mental health practitioner. I didn't mention her in the book, but she was a big part of that assessment. And she was a real pioneer of the whole concept of neurodiversity and the fact that it isn't entirely about the fault part, that you just need some area of adjustment. And then there was my kindergarten teacher, who even long after I was a student there, was a very passionate and strong advocate, making sure that I was getting exactly what I need and didn't take any nonsense from anyone within the school system. And then, of course, there's my brother. He's always been great, my older brother. I had sensory therapy where he had to brush me every day from head to toe. And he was let out of class once a day to go and brush his sister, as strange as that sounds. And although ever since, he's been extremely patient and strong advocate in the sense that, like, if I ever was struggling, if I ever needed anything, he would help without any sort of hesitation. Even when we were young, he didn't see my difference as a difference, really. He saw it as, I will just keep teaching you basic things that all kids are familiar with, like throwing a ball and catching a ball and things like that, just until you get it. And that shouldn't stop us from having a normal childhood.
It's wonderful to have those people. And it's always amazing, I think, especially for neurodivergent people who are now adults. I would say anybody who had either a disability or learned and thought differently when they were young. There are those people, even at a very early age, who maybe we've even lost contact with, but it's so impactful that we remember it so vividly, those people who advocated for us or supported us, and how important those relationships are, just to kind of help fulfill, our goals and everything. Like having just those people that believe in us can be really impactful.
Yeah, it's so important. I hear so many quite hard stories of people that aren't diagnosed too much later or don't have the good fortune that I did of having supportive family around. And yeah, that's they're much more likely to have mental health challenges, all kinds of things, much more likely to struggle in the workplace. Mm-hmm. So it's really, really important.
Building on that, I think that the concept of self-advocacy is both extremely important and very difficult. And depending on one's relationship with their diagnosis and the environment that they're in, self-advocacy can be really difficult. Sometimes deciding whether to share a diagnosis with others can be difficult. How have your self-advocacy efforts evolved throughout your lifetime?
Well, when I was quite young and in school, I had a lot of people who were helping me and supporting me and making sure that I had what I needed, like many of the ones I just mentioned. But as I got older, that's when it really got more difficult because I was expected to figure it out on my own, and I didn't have access to the greatest resources. I had to really make a lot of mistakes and learn a lot at once to figure out really what the difference is between being in my 20s and being in school and what I need. And that's the thing. That's the thing not a lot of people talk about once you're thrust into university and the workforce and such. Everyone just expects you have this figured out, but there's no such thing as an instruction manual for this, and you're left having to figure this out on your own.
How have you decided when to share your diagnosis with people? Have there been situations that you've handled differently depending on what was occurring at the time, and what were some of those influencing factors?
I always tell people there isn't really a simple answer to this.
Yeah.
What has been great about being on the other side and getting to work with people who influence how comfortable being in the workplace is for neurodivergent people is it's been enlightening to figure out that a big part of it is that people on the other side of things don't know how to communicate what a safe environment looks like. And so really it's just a matter of judging how people talk about disabilities, how they talk about neurodiversity, how they talk about other differences, but more in social everyday situations. I find that it's really just about just slowly having a conversation saying, I need the following. And when it feels safe, saying it is because I have this issue and we gotta talk about this.
Being able to talk about those things also just helps to normalize them for people and helps to broaden the understanding that many people have about different types of diagnoses or neurodiversity that maybe they were unfamiliar with before. And not that that should always fall on the shoulders of neurodivergent people to do that education, but I do feel like there's some value there as well.
Yeah, for sure. It shouldn't fall on us to do the education, but it has to feel normal and natural and right. And I find that even just like social situations that you take for granted, like how I told my husband's friends that I was neurodivergent, is it was just a really slow, gradual process. I started to go to these social events where we were playing a lot of board games and such. And the only way it really worked was because a lot of those had elements that those challenges would come up. So it felt natural to say, actually, I will need help with this. Could you say that instruction in a different way? And slowly but surely, it made more sense. And as soon as I started to feel that people were more accepting of that sort of thing and they didn't care as long as I had fun and I felt safe, then that's really all I needed.
So a common question related to neurodivergent diagnosis is whether or not the process of receiving that formal diagnosis is useful. So in addition to some of the barriers that many people face as they go through that diagnostic process, sometimes people seem to feel like labels are overused. I think we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but I am curious, like, what are your thoughts about seeking a formal diagnosis for dyspraxia and how people might overcome some of the barriers that they might face in that process?
Here's the thing, just like most types of neurodivergence, there's a very, very significant inequality issue, both with the access to the diagnosis or being in a sort of area code lottery where it doesn't matter how much money you make and there might be some level of compensation for getting what you need, or even just your access to those resources. And yeah, I think it makes it quite challenging, and the best we can do is just try to see what types of support are out there and what we can get by going to our doctors and petitioning politicians for better support services for this, because it's really not that simple. That's why I have been so accepting of the concept of self-diagnosis, because it's really, really hard to get, especially if you're not fortunate enough to get it when you're young. But at the same time, it is beneficial. The real advantage is legitimacy. The real advantage is that you have a piece of paper you can show to someone and say, like, look, I have a specific reason why I need to work in this way, not this way.
So you mentioned talking to a general practitioner as the first step. Do occupational therapists do this type of assessment? Like, what are some of the steps that somebody might take if they wanted to seek that diagnosis either for themselves or their child?
Yeah, first you would go to your occupational therapist. I would recommend, not your occupational therapist, your doctor. And I would recommend going prepared with resources. I'll list a few here, but if you aren't able to write it down, I'll ask Emily later to put it in the show notes. Some good ones to look at are Lexix has a great write-up on dyspraxia. The Dyspraxia Foundation has a good write-up on that subject. And a small publication run by my friend Crystal Shaw, Dyspraxia Magazine, has tons and tons of really helpful resources. So if you go prepared with things like that to your general practitioner and say, look, I suspect that this issue is a thing, that is a great, great starting point, because you can't count on the fact that they necessarily will even know about dyspraxia. So you need to come prepared. And from there, they can recommend medical professionals or occupational therapists in your area that specialize in providing this diagnosis. Usually it would be people who also do other types of neurodiversity stuff as well.
So for those in our audience who are supporting dyspraxic people, whether they're family members or educators or clinicians, what are some good examples of accommodations that could be useful in supporting dyspraxia?
Many of them are very similar to what you would provide for an autistic person, just because they're more environmental based. They would be things like wearing headphones at work, when you're doing quiet tasks, having access to a sensory-friendly environment where if you're feeling overwhelmed, you can go close the door for a minute and it's somewhere quiet and laid back where you can rest and recharge. And also, even just conveying complex instructions in a written way goes a long, long way.
So that way, being able to refer back to those instructions, if they're written out, having that visual reminder, being able to look at it that way as opposed to just retaining it from auditorily hearing it.
Yeah, and I would also add planning and processing are also a big challenge to keep in mind. Like a dyspraxic person may not know that a certain task they would need an hour or 30 minutes because in their mind that would look like largely the same thing. So any small planning activities you can do to work around that and really just to provide some sense of exactly how much time things are going to take and a visual representation of time required to do certain things.
Rosemary, this has been a really great interview. And so I have one last question as we wrap up. If you had the chance to talk to a young person who is newly diagnosed with dyspraxia, what's the one thing that you would want them to hear?
Just that you need to exercise kindness when thinking about how you're processing the world around you, because that can be very, very difficult for a lot of people just like us. So just take into consideration and be as kind as you possibly can about how much you take on and what you say yes to.
Rosemary Richings, author of Stumbling Through Time and Space, Living Life with Dyspraxia. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Yeah.
Dyspraxia is one of the many types of neurodivergence that is less well known and understood, meaning it can easily be missed and go undiagnosed. However, motor coordination can impact many areas of a person's life, from their ability as a child to learn to sit or walk, to how they're able to get their words down on paper, whether that's through typing or writing with a pencil as they get older. And, as is my common refrain, awareness of this type of neurodiversity is key to helping people recognize when they need support and to be able to advocate for themselves. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks again, Keri Wilmot and Rosemary Richings. We have more information about them, as well as some dyspraxia resources, in the show notes and on the episode page at neurodiversitypodcast.com. Also, don't forget, October is ADHD Awareness Month, and we'll be presenting a special series on the subject of ADHD. We have some great guests ahead, so be sure to subscribe if you haven't yet. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our social media and production assistant is Krista Brown. The executive producer and studio editor is me, Dave Morris. For everyone here, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This is a production of the Neurodiversity Alliance.